Hopefully you had some success in implementing both the weave and peek functions. In this video, we're going to go over the solution to both of them. We're going to first start off inside of our queue.js file and implement that peek function. Before we do, one quick thing I wanted to clarify. You'll notice this note down here where I said do not access the array inside the queue. That was specifically talking about part 2 of this task. For part 1, you definitely are able to and can and absolutely should access the array sitting inside the queue. So for the peek function, we are going to work directly with that array. I do apologize if that was a little bit unclear. All right, so inside of my weave directory, I'm going to find the queue.js file. So inside of here, we have our class queue. I want to add another method called peek to this thing that is going to return the last element, or essentially the next one that is supposed to be returned. All right, so down at the bottom, I'll add a new method called peek. Now first, we need to get access to the last element, or the next element that is going to be returned from calling remove on this queue. So that's essentially the last element inside of our data array. To get access to that last element, we can reference this.data at this.data.length -1, like so. And then we will return that from this method. All right, let's check our tests over in the terminal and see if we have our tests around peek working now. So I'll rerun my tests, and it looks like, yep, the 2 tests that were written around peek appear to be passing correctly, so I think that we're in a good spot. So now we can move on to the weave function. Back inside my code editor, I'll change back to the index.js file, and then I'm going to scroll down to the weave function. So I think that the first step here is pretty clear. I think that we need to create a new queue that can store the combined result of source 1 and source 2. So we'll say const queue is new queue. Next, we need to make sure that we somehow iterate through all the different elements inside of source 1 and source 2 without accessing the arrays inside them. And so that's where the peek function that we just defined on queue is going to come into play. I think that we can probably somehow figure out how to iterate or how to run some chunk of code as long as either source 1 or source 2 has an element that is being returned from peek. Remember, if there are no elements left inside of our data array in a queue, then the peek function will probably return undefined. And so that's a key point that we need to keep in mind. So I think that to iterate through all the elements in both these queues right here, we can probably use a while loop. So if we use a while loop, we can say that as long as either source 1 or source 2 returns a not undefined value, that's kind of unclear, but a value that is not undefined from their peek methods, then we should continue iterating with this while loop. So in practice, essentially what we want to say is source1.peek or source2.peek, like so. So as long as either one of these is returning a method, then we're good to go. Next, inside the while loop itself, we're going to add some logic to first take an element out of source 1 and add it to our queue, and then take an element out of source 2 and add it to our queue. The thing to keep in mind here is that we're not quite out of the weeds with making sure that we are not pushing undefined values into this third queue just yet. So remember, we are saying or here in looking at whether or not we should continue our while loop. So it's entirely possible that source 1 could run out of elements, but source 2 could still have elements inside of it. And based on the conditions of our while loop right now, we don't really have any idea which one still has elements inside of it that we want to continue to pull out. So in short, we have to check the peek function again on both of these queues and make sure that they both still have elements inside them before we attempt to take something out and insert it into the third queue. So we're going to say if source1.peek, so if there's still an element inside there, we'll say queue.add source1.remove, like so. And then we're going to repeat the same process for source 2 as well. So if source2.peek, queue.add source2.remove. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now don't forget, I can't say it enough, In all these questions, you always want to make sure that you have some defined return value. So at the bottom of the function, after doing all this combination, we will finally return Q. Let's check our tests and see how we're doing. And we have 4 tests passing. Fantastic. So this is looking pretty good. I think that we've got a great solution here. Let's continue in the next video where we're going to move on to our next data structure that is very closely related to queues. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.